Hello everyone, my name is Dhiittaa. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it for taking time from your busy schedule to attend our event. This means so much to us. Thank you so much. Like I said, my name is Dhiittaa. I'm gonna be introducing our next speaker, who is Jeff Sarton, a minister at Plymouth Congress Church, where he has been serving since 2001.
The event, entitled Ethiopia to Minnesota, Closer Together Than You Think, that took place on November 19, 2017, was really a success. It is a success in terms of the turnout, because we got more than 70 people, 70 Americans, and it is also a success because among the participants we have senators and we have a mayor in that event. So it is also a success in that regard. And also we had a media coverage, the Star Tribune, and also we have a lot of coverage on social media. Because the objective of this event was to let Americans know about their neighbors, the Oromo immigrants who live in the United States, that a genocide is taking place in Ethiopia against their relatives, their family members, and so we wanted the Americans to be aware that we, even though some of Ethiopians are citizens here, we're very concerned about other Ethiopians who are back home. So we wanted Americans to stand in solidarity with us, to stand against the genocide, the grave human rights violation that is taking place in Ethiopia.
So it is a pleasure to be here today. Thank you again all for coming. And my role will be to moderate this panel of guests that we have here today. Plymouth Church, just down Franklin Avenue, has long been engaged in helping to welcome immigrant groups into this country. In fact, many years ago, our congregation has been established for 160 years. So in Minneapolis, we've seen many immigrant groups come in the life of the congregation. So it is appropriate that we're here in Norway House because our church helped welcome the Scandinavian immigrants when they arrived in this country and established a school for them. And we have this concern for our neighborhood, that we understand who is living with us in our neighborhood and what are their concerns and what concerns in other parts of the world are affecting their lives. So this is important for us, and I'm glad to be here to help with this. So today, our panelists, you have their bios with you in the program. We're very pleased that we have Amy Berquist here, staff attorney at the International Justice for the Advocates for Human Rights. We also have Robin Phillips. Robin Phillips is here, executive director for the Advocates for Human Rights. We have Ezekiel Gavisa, Doctor of History from Michigan State University, Professor of History at Kettering University. And we have Chris Gehring here, Executive Director, the Center for Victims of Torture. And we have Negesa Orodube and Oromo with us. Please welcome the panelists. So now we will hear from each of them. We'll take a little bit more time than we thought we might have to begin with, so we're glad we have a little bit of spaciousness of time. We have each 10 or so minutes, 10 or 15 minutes for each of them to speak. And then after that, we'll have questions and answers. And at the very end, we will share ideas of ways you can be involved to help.
Welcome, everyone. And it's really great to be here and see all of you here, eager to learn more about the Oromo community and how you can get involved. And before I begin, I want to thank all of the organizers of this event, but in particular, Kathleen Seastad. Kathleen, give everyone a wave. she's really the driving force and energy behind this event, along with the United Oromo Voices group. And for those of you who are members of the United Oromo Voices group, can you raise your hand so we can see who you are as well? I see Samuel in the back. Great. So those are also organizers of this event as well, and I hope you'll have a chance to get to know them better too. I also want to welcome Professor Ezekiel Gibby, so it's really an honor to be here with you and have your perspective on things. So it's really great that you're willing to come here to Minnesota to speak with us. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of the human rights situation in Ethiopia and talk a little bit about ways that all of you can get involved to help improve the human rights situation in Ethiopia. So first, just a little bit of history, and for those of you who are already familiar with this, I apologize if it's a little bit of repetition, but I think it's always good to make sure we all have some similar background. Ethiopia is in the eastern part of Africa, and for all of you trivia buffs, it's a landlocked country, and it's one of the only countries in Africa not to be colonized by Europeans. So 2 important trivia points there. It has a population of roughly 95 million people, so it's one of the more populous countries in Africa. And it geographically is divided up into 9 regional states, one of which is Oromia. And that's where the most, but not all, of the Oromo people live in Ethiopia. The official language of Ethiopia is Amharic. And Ethiopia, as perhaps is suggested by having these different regional states, it is can be divided up in terms of religion and also in terms of ethnicity. Approximately 43 or 44% of Ethiopians are Ethiopian Orthodox Christian, then another 15 or 16% are Protestant Christian, approximately 34% of Ethiopians are Muslim, and another 2 or 3% follow traditional religions. There are approximately 80 different ethnic groups in Ethiopia, and of all of those ethnic groups, the largest, but not the majority, the largest ethnic group is the Oromo. And they make up approximately 35 to 40% of the population of Ethiopia. In others, not only are people being arrested, their relatives can't find them, and the government doesn't acknowledge where they're being held, if they're being held, or whether they're even still alive. Another human rights violation that's acknowledged by our government is torture in detention. The Ethiopian government does allow visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross, but doesn't allow any other international independent organizations to come and monitor what the conditions are in prison. And there are widespread reports of torture, as I'm sure you'll hear later. In terms of who is getting arbitrarily arrested and detained, it's not only protesters, but also professors, university students, musicians, business relatives back home in Ethiopia for their involvement in protests and criticism of the government here in Minnesota and in other parts of the world where people have more of an ability to exercise their right to free speech. The government, this is again from the State Department report, the government reportedly used a widespread system of paid informants to report on the activities of particular individuals, intimidating and unwelcome visits to their homes and offices, and they intimidated family members. So that happens in Ethiopia, but also around the world. What I've described to you from the State Department report is confirmed by the words and stories of the asylum-seeking clients that the Advocates for Human Rights represents. And I want to say that there is a contradiction between what the United States government says about the human rights situation in Ethiopia and what the United States government does with its money. Ethiopia is the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid in sub-Saharan Africa. And of the low-income countries, it's also the second largest recipient of U.S. aid in the world. So we put a lot of money, a lot of funding into Ethiopia while at the same time acknowledging these human rights violations. In terms of advocacy, I guess I'll leave that to the Q&A section, but there's a great opportunity for all of you to help advocate for reducing the human rights violations that are happening in Ethiopia. A key date I want you to remember is September 20th, 2018. That's the deadline for the next report that we all can submit to the United Nations. And you can work with the Oromo people to get the information they have about what's happening in Ethiopia, because there are not independent civil society organizations there, to get that information to the UN so that the United Nations can pressure the Ethiopian government to abide by its international human rights obligations. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for coming, and I echo Amy's thanks to the organizers. My name is Robin Phillips, and I'm the Executive Director at the Advocates for Human Rights. And I will talk a little bit today about advocacy and how the Advocates has worked with the Oromo community in advocacy locally, nationally, and internationally. And I actually may hand the mic back to my colleague to talk a little bit about international advocacy, but I will take you through a little bit of background first. At the Advocates, we do a lot of work with diaspora communities. And when we talk about diaspora, what we mean, we're talking about people who have emigrated from their home countries and settled in countries around the world. And we don't use the term immigrant because it extends generations beyond the first immigrants and really is a self-selecting, self-identifying group connected to a country. In Minnesota, we have a lot of immigrants, and we have the highest percentage of refugees in our immigrant population in the country. People come to Minnesota for many reasons, like they do to other countries or to other states as well. They come for economic opportunity. They come fleeing persecution. They come for family reunification. Thank you. And for many other reasons. Many people who come to Minnesota from Ethiopia came fleeing persecution. And we've worked with Oromo and other Ethiopian ethnic groups throughout the history of the Advocates over 35 years. Initially, our work focused mainly on free legal services for people seeking asylum here, and in attending 75 Oromo clients. While that work continues to be a core part of our work, and we continue to represent Oromo people, we've expanded beyond that. We've had groups come to the Advocates asking for assistance. And this really started to happen from my very first day being executive director. A group from South Asia came to tell me that they wanted the Advocates working on religious minority issues in India. It was sparked by the massacres in Gujarat. And a group from the Oromo community, several who are here today, came along with Kathleen not long after that, encouraging us to start looking at the pattern of abuses, that we had this treasure trove of information from our asylum clients, and that we should be using that to advocate for improvements in Ethiopia. And we initially were our first and most important ethical obligation is to clients. And as we talked with people, adjusting to life here, and many people were very concerned about what was happening to people they left behind after they fled. And many in the groups that were coming to talk with us were very patient as we worked through a methodology that respected the rights of individual clients, but also allowed them to participate in documentation and fact-finding that would allow their stories to be used to influence work at the United Nations, to influence the government of the United States, and to educate the community here. So we started, our first work with the Oromo community was to document human rights violations against Oromo people. We looked at Ethiopia through the eyes of the Oromo diaspora. We published a report in 2012, and immediately within a month, and usually human rights reports aren't grabbed that quickly, but the report was cited by the Immigration Court. Then the next month was cited by the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, preparing for the Universal Periodic Review. of Ethiopia. And then it had recently, is this year, been used in pleadings in district court or in federal district court in the United States to show the problems in Ethiopia and what's happening to Oromo people. Also, and I actually will turn it over to Amy for a few of my minutes. Amy has done enormous amounts of work, both in creating a manual called Paving Pathways for Justice and Accountability, which is really a manual for engaging diaspora communities in human rights. And she's done a lot of work at the United Nations. So I'll let Amy talk a little bit about that.
With our moderator's permission. Oh, sorry. So the advocates, as Robin described, has worked a lot with the Oromo people to try to amplify their voice, particularly at the United Nations. So I'll give you two examples. As I mentioned, the student protests in 2014 happened in April and May. And as it turned out, the United Nations was reviewing Ethiopia's human rights record in May 2014. And this is a review that happens every 4.5 years. And ordinarily, because this is a diplomatic process, ordinarily countries already have scripted out the statement that they're going to make for the review. They get that scripted out weeks in advance. But because of this breaking human rights situation in Ethiopia, we had submitted a report back in September of 2013, but we supplemented that with some vigorous email lobbying right before the Universal Periodic Review of Ethiopia, this UN review process. And most of the countries were not able to change their statements on the fly, but Armenia did. And so Armenia, and this is from the official record of this review that happened in May 2014, we told them about this breaking human rights situation in Oromia, and Armenia, in the official record, commended Ethiopia's commitment to the promotion of human rights, including respect for minority rights, cultural diversity, and tolerance, and expressed concern at reported recent casualties in Ethiopia. So that was really powerful to have the government of Armenia raise that issue in this review of Ethiopia at the Human Rights Council in May of 2014. Armenia also made a recommendation to the government of Ethiopia on that point. So Armenia's recommendation was that the government of Ethiopia further promote tolerance and dialogue between different ethnic and religious groups. And the way this particular review works is the government that receives the recommendations has the choice to accept or reject the recommendations. The government of Ethiopia accepted that recommendation. And what's really great about that is that now, on September 20th, 2018, we have the chance to issue a report card. Has the government of Ethiopia kept its word? It made a public commitment at the United Nations Human Rights Council to further promote tolerance and dialogue between different ethnic and religious groups. And we get to say, as independent members of civil society, whether they did that and to what extent, because the Ethiopian government made that public commitment. Other public commitments the government of Ethiopia made during that review that are particularly relevant to what we're talking about today. The government of Ethiopia accepted a recommendation from Finland to continue efforts to ensure that clear, independent, and effective complaints mechanisms are in place for individuals' complaints concerning mistreatment by security and law enforcement authorities. The government of Ethiopia agreed to do that. And I'm sure if you talk to Oromos who have lived in Ethiopia for the past 4 years, they would tell you that there are not independent complaint mechanisms in place. So what we get to do is write reports to submit to the United Nations for the next Universal Periodic Review of Ethiopia, which is going to happen in May of 2019. We submit these reports in September of next year, detailing what's actually happened since the time Ethiopia made these commitments and what recommendations should be made to the government of Ethiopia going forward so they can actually be held accountable and improve their human rights record. Another thing I had the chance to do in September of 2014 is travel to Geneva with a group of Oromo youth, the International Oromo Youth Association, for the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child's review of Ethiopia. So we were able to meet in a closed-door session with members of the committee to brief them on the human rights situation there. And it's really telling because ordinarily there are also human rights non-governmental organizations from the country under review who meet with the committee experts. There were no civil society organizations from Ethiopia there in Geneva. There were no civil society organizations from Ethiopia that even submitted reports. So it's really important. And then he immediately arrived, acts on the of the United States. So really important the world can put pressure on the government obligations.
Okay, just to close out the advocates, in like one more minute. Just to the broader community here as well, some of the more familiar ways of advocacy, advocating at Congress, there are currently 2 resolutions in Congress, one on the House side, one in the Senate, condemning human rights violations in Ethiopia and calling on the Ethiopian government to improve the situation. Fortunately, virtually all of Minnesota delegation has signed on except Colin Peterson, so anyone who has influence with him can advocate with him to sign on as well, but also to thank the congressional delegation for doing that and to keep it moving through Congress is really important. Also, there's other ways to do advocacy to, as Amy mentioned, the large amount of foreign aid that goes to the Ethiopian government, that we can lobby our congressional delegation or advocate with them to put stipulations onto that aid and to really push a human rights agenda with the Ethiopian government. So for anybody who's interested in that and interested in other ways of documenting human rights violations, there's room for everybody and lots of work. Please talk with Amy or me after. Oh, yes, and then also,
You may have noticed the 2 microphones up here, and the one microphone belongs to the Oromia Media Network, which is based here in Minneapolis, but it's an international satellite news organization that actually is able, when the government isn't blocking the satellite feed, able to broadcast into Ethiopia. And there are a lot of Oromos who watch OMN, and for them to see all of you here tonight wanting to learn about the Oromo people and the human rights situation in Ethiopia, that alone is a huge sign of solidarity. So it's not just what's happening in this room, but what's happening in this room is being shared with Oromos in Ethiopia. So thank you for being here to show your support.
I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I usually get invited, but they don't pay for my ticket usually, but this time they paid for my ticket. And everybody for coming. Thank you very much. I appreciate the fact that Amy was able to situate us historically in Ethiopia to understand what's going on. The advocacy work to put pressure on the enablers of the Ethiopian government, such as the United States, is important. I believe that Ethiopia is already in a process of change. What kind of change, we don't know. But there is change underway already. They spoke about the Oromo protests. They spoke about the Oromo protests. This epochal phenomenon or epochal event is unprecedented in Ethiopian history and even in the history of Africa. There have been social movements in the past, but the theories that explain what social movements are cannot explain the Oromo movement. For one, it is a social movement from below that involved almost all people, Oromo people from all walks of life. For another, it lasted for 3 years and still going on. This is a kind of social phenomenon that we don't understand, but we probably saw in the first instance in North Africa was the Arab Spring. In some places in the Arab Spring, as you all know, some experienced transition, others were scuttled. I think what is going on in Ethiopia is a process of change, but if we remain engaged, I think Ethiopians and Oromo have a possibilities for emancipatory dispensation. What I want to talk about is there are three political dispensations in Ethiopia. The first one is the Imperial socialist period, in which one group of Ethiopians, the Amhara, dominated the political system, the economic system, and the cultural scene. The Amhara, when they were in power, when they dominated the Ethiopian political scene, they did dominate the political power, excluding people like the Oromo, who are the majority, by the way. It was characterized by cultural alienation and exploitation, economic exploitation. There was some level of corruption at that time as well, but it is not anything that we have seen comparing to what's going on today. What you have today in Ethiopia is an ethnocratic system, I would say, dominated by people from the north known as the Tigrayan people, constituting about 6% of the population. But their kind of domination is, I really want to say this, usually we talk about rule of law. What we see in Ethiopia is rule by law, in which a group of people, a coterie of politicians or members of a political party, win elections after elections, and they dominate the parliament. They win 100% of the seats, and then they pass laws that are antagonistic to the constitution itself. These laws that Amy talked about are unconstitutional, but that's what rule by law means, not rule of law. Rule by law, that where you use the law after capturing the political system, you use the law in order to persecute your political opponents. When it comes to corruption or domination of the state system, what we experience today in Ethiopia is what is a phenomenon known as state capture, where a group of people actually capture the state and unashamedly use that system to loot the resources of the country. It is a kleptocratic system that knows no shame as far as exploitation is concerned. So the Amhara have had their time, the Tigrayans are having their time, they're defending the present. And what I wanted to say today is that the Oromo, that constitutes about 50% of the population, that have been politically marginalized, economically exploited, culturally alienated, actually now hold out possibilities for liberation for all people of Ethiopia. And I want to say why. The first thing is that over the last half century, Ethiopia has had what an eminent University of Chicago sociologist named Donald Levine called structural openings. Or these are opportunities for transition to a participatory political system, a participatory democracy, if you would like to say. And Donald Levine says there were, in the last 50 years, there were about 5 structural openings where Ethiopians could have taken the road to a participatory system in which people have a voice in their own government. The first one occurred in 1960 with a coup d'etat, an attempted coup d'etat, which was put down. Another one occurred in 1974 with a revolution in Ethiopia. The third occurred in 1991 when the Derg government fell. And then there was an opportunity also with the Ethio-Eritrean War in 1998. And there was a greater possibility for taking the road to democratization and people's involvement in 2005. But it didn't happen. All of these democratic changes were mishandled and squandered and resulted in escalating valorization of murder, violence, and political domination. At all of 5 transitions, there were attempted transitions, but they were all characterized by violence. Ethiopia has never had a peaceful transition for transition in the last 50 years, at least in the last 50 years. Some scholars suggest that the failure to democratize in Ethiopia is due to the absence of an indigenous ideas or models of change. Ethiopia's rulers have always, or elites, the elites, opinion makers, have always sought to achieve political and economic modernization by emulating the experiences of outsiders. This started in the 19th century when Ethiopia looked to Tsarist Russia for models of economic change, followed by Japan in the interwar period where the progressives of Ethiopia, the so-called progressives of the time, looked to Japan for models of change and constitutional monarchy. And after World War II, the West became the model for modernization, political and economic modernization. First, the British, who actually evicted the Italians out of Ethiopia in 1941, and then the United States during the period of the Cold War. This provided the blueprint for Ethiopia's development. In 1974, the imperial government of Emperor Haile Selassie fell and was replaced by leftist intellectuals and military officers who now looked to USSR, the Soviet Union, for models of economic and political change. That ended with the end of the Cold War as well. In 1991, a group of guerrilla forces, they won the civil war and overthrew the government, and they had a possibility to answer two of the major problems in Ethiopia. That is, the first one is the control of resources, the question of land. The second is the question of nationalities. They did attempt to resolve these issues by attacking them head on. Now, when they came to power in 1991, they experimented with an amalgam of Marxist and liberal economic policies, but commencing in 2005, they settled on what is known as the democratic developmental state, which envisages, and listen to this, a dominant party remaining in power until Ethiopia has emerged out of poverty. That is, elections would be held, but only to confirm the dominant party in power. The rationale is that elections that actually occur every 4 years, people who win with good ideas get into office, but then they are voted out of before their policies have been implemented and start to bear fruit. What's the solution? Have a democratic developmental state where a dominant party remains in power indefinitely, at least indefinitely in the sense that until Ethiopia has become a middle-class country. When is that? 2025. So the minimum time that they required is that in 2025, this party would leave power after ensuring that Ethiopia had become an economically developmental state. That is a problem. The problem for democratization in Ethiopia that we have not really looked at is that we have always experimented with models that are not suitable to the realities of the country. Here is where I would say the Oromo people who are actually were driven out of power, excluded from power for almost 100 years, now hold out the possibility of offering an indigenous system of change, an indigenous system of political and economic modernization. I think Amy talked about the Gada system. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the Gada system is the civilization of the Oromo. What Gada is the totality of Oromo civilization. But before I say anything about that, I'd like to say something about structural openings that I talked about before. Structural openings are moments of which are composed of change, possibilities for change, possibilities for dynamic interplay of change. They are opportunities. There are also moments of opportunities, but also of danger. If people choose, people in the arena, in the political arena, consider new ideas, take these opportunities to try to chart find workable solutions for existing political problems, those could be opportunities for transformative change. But there are also dangerous moments. So what I am saying is that the Oromo protests, which I described earlier, the Oromo protests have now opened that possibility. There is a structural opening in Ethiopia for transformative change, where Ethiopians would participate in their government and decide the type of economic system that they would want, rather than a system where a political party actually dominates the political scene through, as I say, rule of law, the rule by law, and capture the state to exploit. There is a possibility now, a possibility occasioned by the Oromo protest in Ethiopia. But to that, the Amhara, which had this system of assimilation, and dominated the political scene for almost 1 century, have had their time. The elite today look back. What they want to do is to return to the past. The Tigrayans from the north that are dominating the political system are defending the present that is unworkable and unsustainable. It has already been pushed over the cliff by the protests. It cannot be sustained. A system that actually ostracizes people in their own country cannot be sustained. There is no doubt about that. But what I say is the Oromo people now have their time. They have brought down a government. It is in a multi-dimensional crisis of legitimacy, of economics, of political system, of military system. It is a system that cannot go on. But how is it going to be replaced? That's where I say the Oromo people have that indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous institutions, indigenous systems of democracy or democratization. They're not a minority. The Oromo people would benefit from making the country peaceful, making the country grow in development, also in democratization. They have no fear of democracy. They also have this treasure trove of knowledge systems, institutions that are all encapsulated in the Gada system. If I had the time and the possibility, I would have gone through this, but let me highlight what that really means. That the Gada system, and I'm going to quote here, that it is a system that regulates political, social, economic, and religious lives of the Oromo. It's an indigenous system of socialization, education, peacemaking, conflict resolution, judicial administration, religious expression, economic organization, and social harmony. As such, the Gada system is an all-encompassing system of laws. As one anthropologist said, the Oromo people are the people of laws. They have laws for anything. They have laws even for keeping concubines. They have laws for everything. They have laws that protect the trees. They have laws that protect dogs and everything. These are the people of laws. The rule of law is not an alien concept to the Oromo people. It is the mark of their identity. It is what they are. So that's what the Gada system is. It is a system that can serve as the foundation of democratization of Ethiopia, not just the Oromia region. It's 50% of Ethiopia after all. But the Gada system, the Oromo Gada system, it's not here. It's not Ezekiel that said this. It's also Donald Levine, who actually said something about the political system over here. He actually said, in talking about the fact that the Gada system could be extended. This man is a man of rare insight into Ethiopian culture. So he suggests, and I quote, Ethiopians need to understand and celebrate the Gada system as an exemplar of the values of all Ethiopia and beyond. Levine is even more direct in underscoring that the Gada systems, and I'm quoting, the Gada system's achievement in the practice of democratic governance could be transferred to the Ethiopian nation as a whole. But more importantly, says he also added that if the Oromos live by the precepts of their Gada system, they would play a transformative part in the current democratization in the world. Why is he saying that? And he was on NPR even saying that the American Congress needs the values of the Oromo Gada system on NPR. Why is he saying that? Because of a number of values and principles that are not simply the democratic system of yesterday, but the democratic foundation that could be used for the democratization of every democratic country or aspiring democratic country in the world. What he means is that transplanted democracy doesn't work. You can try as an American, you can try to transplant democracy in Iraq. It doesn't work because the foundation is not ready. But the Oromo have a Gada system, a political system that actually has egalitarian ethos. The Oromo people are always led by this egalitarian ethos, where Oromo tradition deflates a hierarchy in favor of egalitarian norms. This is not in government. It is also in interpersonal relations, where people the Oromo people relate to each other as Dhiittaa, they call them, or equal. That is important. It's traditional, but it's also utilizable even today. The second is communal solidarity. In the pursuit of individual interests. And this is the reason why a transplanted Jeffersonian type, cutthroat type, competitive democracy doesn't work in countries like Ethiopia or among the Oromo. The pursuit of individual interest among the Oromo is always frowned upon. You always present the greater good. You don't even pray to God saying that God do this for me as an individual. It is for us. That is the solidarity. That is still important. The other is the separation of powers and term limits. That is, in traditional Oromo social structure, it ensures that power can never be concentrated in one spot. It's a system that embodies allocating political power equitably across generations. That means in the social organization, everyone gets the turn to rule. You don't have to rush. You get your time to rule. But there is also an allocated role for anybody. That prevents conflict as well. And when your time ends every 8 years, so your term ends, there is no reason why you would insist to remain in office. You leave office because it's somebody else's turn. It is that kind of system that is the foundation. It is that kind of democratization that could work, that is based on lived realities and the indigenous foundations of the people. The other is, for democracy, civility in deliberation. To facilitate mutual respect in democratic deliberations, Oromo customs encourages civility in public discourse. In the Gada assemblies, or in the Gada chapter or the assemblies, the multitude of representatives of the people, leaders open the meetings by admonishing when they start. It's not the chaplain that speaks. The leaders of the assembly admonish speakers to avoid provocative languages and not to use the floor to score points or to self-aggrandize and self-promote. That will be frowned upon. And it's not just the leaders, it's the culture that militates against self-promotion, self-aggrandizement. These are principles. These are principles from Oromo tradition. These are principles that are still workable. That is why I say that if Ethiopia wants democracy, if Ethiopians need democracy, the models from elsewhere have not worked. We borrowed it from Russia, from the United States, from Britain, from France, from Britain, now from China. It just didn't work. This one will work. Possibility. Now, the other thing is that politics is one thing, but economics is also important. What we say today in the world, that development is important, but development has to be sustainable, has to be inclusive, and it has to be broad-based, and it has to be optimistic. The Oromo theory of development has all of this because it's based on what is known as the finna. Finna simply means to bring in, the core meaning could be different in different forms. How much time?
You're over by about 3 minutes.
Oh, I'm not. Okay. I could have gone on this thing on explaining what the indigenous ideas of the theory of economic development, but there is no time. As always, there is not enough time to talk about the Oromo people.
Right. Question and answer.
All right.
Yeah.
But let me say something about that economic system. It is equitable. The benefits are always, the benefits of growth are sideways, upwards. There are also systems in shape that militate against corruption. The third thing is that a political democratization or even equitable economic system cannot exist if there is no peace. Peace is the foundation for both. And the Oromo have a system of peace, institutions that prevent peace structurally, and a system of peace when, let me read that one and then complete that. Here is what it says, to maintain Naga. And Naga is not conflict. Naga is a system where an individual is at peace with themselves, with their neighbors, with their family, with nature, and with the divine as well. That is what peace means. We don't call conflict. Our goal in the system is not to treat the symptoms. What the Oromos do is always try to restore peace when it is disrupted. What they do is, there are mechanisms, conflict resolution mechanisms that deal with the conflict at 3 levels. To prevent conflict from occurring in the first place, if it occurs from escalating, and if it escalates, to make peace between the conflicting parties through intervention of mediators. That is at least 3 areas of indigenous systems of knowledge and institutions. That is why I say the Oromo are the saviors, are going to be the saviors of Ethiopia altogether. Today, because of the Oromo protests, the fate of Ethiopia to remain a unified polity is going to rest on answering the questions of the Oromo that they've had for 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Kurt Gehring. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Victims of Torture. And I just want to reflect a few seconds on some of what Ezekiel was mentioning insofar as it relates to some of what I think would be beneficial for our own government at this particular moment. When I hear about the values sort of being placed on frowning on self-aggrandizement or self-promotion, I think that is something that would be something that we should value here as well, and we do. Yeah. So I also want to say, first of all, thank you to Kathleen and to the organizers of this event this evening, and also to all of you for spending this part of your Sunday with us. It is so important, I think, for us all to understand a little bit better the reasons why members of our community, the diaspora community, the Oromo, why so many of them are in our community, the circumstances that necessitated them being here, why they had to flee, the refugees among them. And it's really important, the large numbers that are here and the role that they are playing in our community. I think it's very important for us to understand more of their experience. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, to be part of this panel this evening. The Center for Victims of Torture is an organization that plays a very specific role within the overall spectrum of human rights work. And our focus has to do with healing the wounds of one of the most egregious forms of human rights violation, that being torture. We work to heal the wounds on individuals, on family members, on the larger community, as well as to try to stop torture worldwide. And we have programs here in the United States, and in particular here in the Twin Cities area, as well as in other parts of the world, in particular in the Middle East and in Africa. We actually have a program in the northern part of Ethiopia working with Eritrean survivors in 2 of the camps in the north, Adi Harush and Mai Aini, where again we work with survivors, refugees who fled the regime in Eritrea and who are now in camps in the north. We also have programs in Nairobi where we actually see quite a number of Oromo who've had to flee their homeland and seek shelter and safety in the urban areas. They're not in a refugee camp, but they're in the urban areas around Nairobi, survivors of torture and war-related trauma. And of course, we see our staff see here at our healing center in St. Paul, fairly large numbers of Oromo who seek care at our center here. In fact, over the last year, our staff have seen some 40 different ethnicities and nationalities. The single largest one is Oromo. So it gives you some sense, I think, of the magnitude and the severity of the human rights violations that Amy and others described, the impact that has on survivors. So what what our staff here, or what our clients, the survivors, what our clients, as we refer to them as, tell us is much of what you've already heard here today. And in particular, they tell us that over the course, these are the more recent arrivals, over the course of the last little more than a year now, especially since the state of emergency was declared last October, which has now been lifted, in response to the increasing protests, the demonstrations that were taking place. After the state of emergency was declared, there was less of that activity, but the human rights violations actually increased since then. So the violations that we hear about occur in the context of this shrinking space for political activity, the inability for the population to exercise their right to freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. There have been large numbers of arrests over the last year. Some figures cite tens of thousands, up to 30,000 arrests under the state of emergency. And even though that emergency has now been lifted as of last August, some 8,000 or so individuals are said to still be awaiting trial. So who's been targeted? It's almost anyone that the government believes or suspects as being not supportive enough of the government. It can be based on actual opposition activity, or it can be based on what the government suspects might be the case, real or imagined. But really, it's no one has been safe. Our clients have included children, students, adults, as well as people who are elders in the community. And what they have been subjected to, what they tell us, is the whole spectrum of human rights violations under the state of emergency. But I want to emphasize it's not only under the state of emergency, because there were many violations that were also taking place before that state was declared. In addition to the widespread arrests and arbitrary detentions, and this necessitated the government to set up many camps for housing those who were arrested. Some of them were held in secret locations. Some individuals, family members, don't know where they are. They have entered the ranks, so they disappeared. They've been held in, some of them, in underground cells. We see, they come to us, survivors bearing the wound us with perforated eardrums, have lost their hearing. In one case, sight as well, at least in one eye, with fingers missing. Some of them with teeth missing from the beatings that they have endured. That's the sheer physical brutality side of it. There's also many psychological and emotional wounds as a result of the physical treatment, but also the psychological treatment. Persons have been subjected to mock executions, for example, or threats against themselves or threats against their family members. Types of treatment that don't leave, scars as the physical beatings might, but nonetheless are very destructive in terms of individuals' ability to be able to cope. So our work is trying to help these individuals, assist with the care that individuals who've been through this kind of treatment that they need in order to rebuild their lives. And our staff see really the worst of the worst cases. There are so many individuals who are in need of specialized support, and yet the availability of this kind of care is not nearly sufficient or widespread enough. So we only see a fraction of those who are in need, and again, it's individuals who represent the spectrum of the population. We also see the impact of the community here trying to follow the events that are happening in their homeland. They live in fear, many of them, of the next phone call that they are going to receive. What may have happened to their family member? Has that person been arrested? Has that person been disappeared? Has that person been ill-treated? Has that person been the victim of an extrajudicial execution, as was mentioned earlier, that occurred during so many of the protests over the last few months? So these are some of the symptoms that the survivors that we see bear when they come to us. They're in a program where they receive the kind of treatment, the specialized care that they need. And the really uplifting part of this otherwise depressing story is that we see individuals again and again, Oromo as so many other nationalities, who with just a little bit of support, of specialized care, professional treatment, we see them rebuild their lives. We see them go back to school. We see them get new jobs, begin their careers again. The amazing resilience that we see among the Oromo community to become productive citizens of society again is something that really is a source of hope for those of us who work with these populations. So thank you again very much for listening to this, for being part of understanding of what is happening to this really important part of our own community.
My name is Nagesa Odoluwe, and I am an Oromo activist, but I don't start telling my story before I thank the advocates for human rights who provided me with pro bono lawyer, and for which I was granted asylum on July of this year. And I also want to thank the Center for Victims of Torture, which I got treatment, and for which I was healed. Thank you so much. I also thank all of you for participating in this event and listening to these stories. So I was born in a small town called Negele, located in Guji Zone, Oromia Regional State of Ethiopia. I'm a native and citizen of Ethiopia. I currently reside in Minnesota, United States. I am an Oromo activist currently serving as the head of Oromo Federalist Congress International Support Group. I have been persecuted in Ethiopia on account of my political beliefs and ethnic background. I have been repeatedly arrested, detained without trial, imprisoned, and tortured. Even now, my mind is full of ongoing protests, ethnic conflicts designed by the government, and the ongoing genocide in Ethiopia. And also, thousands of political prisoners who are languishing in Ethiopian notorious prisons, most of which I personally know are in my mind. Let me share some of my story and you will begin to understand. I am a member of Oromo ethnic group, which is the largest ethnic group in the country. I began activism when I was attending high school in 1997. I, along with my friends, established Oromo Language and Culture Club in high school, which focused on maintaining the Oromo identity in general. I joined Addis Ababa University in September 2000. Protests and confrontation began as soon as I joined Addis Ababa University. In the same month I joined the university, I heard Oromo students, our seniors, marched to the headquarters of Oromia Regional State, condemning its decision to relocate the capital of the Oromia Regional State to another city called Adama. And there was another protest, which I took part in December 2000, which took place as a result of usage of derogatory name against Oromo. Oromos are called with such derogatory name, Gala, which Oromos never call themselves with. A lot of students arrested and there was federal police raid to the university compound. I cannot narrate all that happened as I will not have time for it. I will focus on those in which I was mainly a victim. On April 10, 2001, the university students protested the dissolution of student association and banning of a student magazine called Helena by government. I was among the thousands of students who took part in that protest. We were gathered in a hall and urged the university president and vice president to talk to us. Soon, the student organizers were arrested, and our demand became release of those students before we would come to the table. The next morning, we continued the protest and federal police invaded the university compound, beating and injuring many of the students, including me. Hundreds of us were imprisoned in the police training camp called Sekale. I was beaten on my right leg with a short police stick, and I could not walk for many weeks. I still carry the scar. After a while, the government declared that all Addis Ababa University students were suspended from the university. It was at this time that the government began to focus on me. I returned to my hometown, Negele, and taught high school classes to Oromo students to help them pass national exam to join university. I continued teaching even when local government authorities told me to stop and that my activity were being reported. Despite their constant spying on me, I refused to quit teaching until we were called up to continue our studies at the university. After 1 year and a half, in September 2003, I was elected the chairman of Oromo Students Union. On January 4, 2004, the Oromo Self-Help Organization, Meta Tulama, called for demonstration to protest against the relocation of capital of the Oromia Regional State from Finfinne, the Oromo name for Addis Ababa, to Nazareth or Adama. I participated in that demonstration, during which the government violently dispersed the demonstration using deadly force. I was arrested along with 4 university students. We were taken to Kazanchis jail. That's a name of a place. During the arrest, the federal police ordered 4 of us to climb a Toyota pickup. As I climbed, they yelled, "Sit down." Even though I was not resisting their commands, one of the security forces kicked me with the pedal of his shoes on my eyes, and all the police on the car repeatedly beaten me using wooden club. My right eye was bleeding. I thought I had lost my vision. I even did not feel any pain when they beat me because of my pain on my eye and the trauma I was suffering from. I sustained an injury to my right eye, which turned red for days. To this day, I carry the scar over my right eyelid from this beating. I was kept in the jail for a day and was released the following day. 2 weeks later, we demonstrated in the university compound, arguing for Oromo Culture and Language Club would be allowed for us. 8 Oromo students had returned to their dormitory after participating in the protest were arrested by the government police. The following day, we continued to protest in front of the president's office, requesting the release of 8 students who had been detained. The president told us to leave or else he would call federal police. We told him we were protesting the detention of our friends. At about 3 p.m., armed federal police forces with machine guns and clubs stormed the university compound and found where we were gathered. They arrested me and other 494 Oromo students. This number, according to government, is 349, were arrested. We were taken to Kolfe Police Training Camp. Our names, places of origin, and departments were registered. We were ordered to take off our shoes and belts. We had to roll up the sleeves of our jackets to our arms and roll the legs of trousers to our knees. We were then forced to run fast, barefooted, and crawling on a graveled field. We were also made to roll on a field and run across field carrying each other. Whenever one of the students was unable to do the physical punishment, he or she would be beaten. This agonizing ordeal continued from 4 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. After that, they divided us in groups of 100 and then forced us into 5 empty halls. There, a piece of bread was given to each of us. We slept on the cold floor for the entire night without bedding or night clothing. There was no restroom or clean water. The guards would say abusive things to us. They would constantly pass by our windows, making various catcalls. We were then taken to a field again, 4:30 a.m., and underwent continued physical punishment till 10 a.m. My legs were swollen and bloody. After these repeated torture, harassment, and interrogation sessions, they recorded all of the students on video. The night we were arrested, the government declared on television, national television, that 23 students were dismissed from university for good, in which my name is number 1 in the list, and that the other 315 students were suspended for 1 year. I was dismissed for good. The decision to dismiss and suspend us was aired on the state-owned television. During my interrogation, they tried to pressure me into joining the government party and to beg for pardon. They told me that I was guilty because I organized protest. We were released on bail after 1 month and a half, but we were not even permitted to return to campus to recover our belongings. In March 2004, most of high school students throughout Oromia regional state began protesting against our dismissal and suspension, and were angry at the cruelty of the government. I was arrested again. I was taken to Federal Police Crime and Forensic Investigation Department, known by the name Makalawi. I didn't even know that I was in Addis Ababa until the next day, because after my arrest, they transported me while my eyes were blindfolded. In Makalawi, they kept me in dark rooms, in Amharic, and in solitary confinement for a month. I was also denied access to family visits and legal counsel. I had restricted access to light. We were only allowed to go out for light for 30 minutes once in a week. My parents were never informed of my whereabouts. I was never charged or given access to lawyer, and I never appeared before a court or a judge. Then I was brought to court. I appealed to the court every abuse I experienced and told that I am innocent. The police investigators were upset when I talked to the judge, and when they took me back to Makalawi, I was called directly to investigation rooms even before I got back to my room. The investigators slapped, kicked, and beat me with batons and gun butts. The investigation officers continuously advised me to work for the government so that I could be released from the horrible place. After 1 month, I was transferred to a larger prison called Addis Ababa Prison Administration, as I was charged. It's called Karchelle, where I stayed for 1 year. In Karchelle, I was in a better position because I met hundreds of other Oromo political prisoners. Even though the prison is divided into 7 different zones, I had friends to talk with and I had access to books. We were transferred to a larger prison at the outskirts of the town called Kaleti, remained in there for nearly 2 years. The handling and the human rights abuse in Ethiopian prison were so grave that 2 students, 2 of my friends, Gaddisa Hirpasa and Alamayo Garba, were killed by the prison guards among 30 of us who had been charged together. Alamayo Garba was shot while Gaddisa Hirpasa was just died out of the torture. I was released after 3 years detention on March 7, 2007. I can't tell all the details. I just focused on my education and graduated in July 2009. However, a friend of mine called Taye Danda, an outstanding student who has been arrested with me for 3 years and who was about to graduate with me, was rearrested just 3 days before graduation. I was so shocked at his detention that I began to worry about myself. I thought that I would be next on their hit list. I lived in a constant fear. On December 5, 2010, a protest broke out in Guji zone, in my place of birth, which is the place of my birth. The protest was against the gold mining company, Midrock Gold, which exploits gold and other mineral resources in the Shakiso area. People were upset at the company as the company was mining without putting any appropriate environmental protection measures in place, without providing infrastructure for local community. 2 students were killed, 4 students were wounded, and about 200 were imprisoned by the government security forces as a result of this protest. I then decided to help the students' movement by getting some media coverage and gave information to BBC Radio English Service, and they interviewed me. I was detained again for a week and tortured. I was released with a warning that I would be killed if I continue this act. After February 2010, I decided to join an opposition political group called Oromo People's Congress, OPC. I got full membership status on March 7, 2010, and began to work with the chairman, Dr. Marara Gudina. I was also chosen to be a candidate in the Nagella constituency to run for parliamentary seat in May 2010 election. Representative of National Electoral Board. I was informed my father's house in Negele, where I was staying while campaigning in the area, was under search. They confiscated the military forces confiscated video camera, laptop, and arrested my brother, Ibsa Ordo. I presented the issue to the officials of Electoral Board of the Oromia region. They immediately talked to the ruling party officials and let me have the camera and laptop back, but they wouldn't free my brother. My brother was not released until 3 months later. Even though I had immunity as a candidate, the privilege was violated. It was intended to intimidate me to withdraw from election because I have been begged by different people, including my relatives, to withdraw from election, and including to accept 100,000 Ethiopian birr and withdraw from election. So this is intimidation. On May 10, 2010, while going to a campaign, I survived a murder attempt. It was at noon, and I was riding a motorbike to conduct a campaign. It was at noon, and I was riding motorbike to conduct a campaign in a rural area called Detention. Militias stopped me on the way and asked whether I had a permit to campaign in the area. I showed them a candidacy ID issued by National Electoral Board. They said that I couldn't pass that way unless I had a letter from ruling party. I told them that I already showed them the document that is required by law, but they insisted I should not pass. When I drove away, after they did not let me pass, another group of militia that was ahead of me fired at me twice. Thank God they missed. I survived. The election was held on May 23, 2010. Since it was fixed and the election laws were not complied with, and a lot of it was wrecked, the ruling party's candidate won the election. In January 2011, two policemen came to see me in Addis Ababa at a place called Saris and stopped me. Okay, let me jump some of the things. Okay. Okay, maybe this part. Okay, while I was looking for the way to escape from the country, I was so happy that I got admission from Winona State University in the United States. Then I began to pray for visa from U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa. It was very clear to me that I would face either detention, like my friends, by then my colleagues, Bekele Garba and Obana Lelisa, if I refused to accept the offer by the government. I was interviewed at the U.S. Embassy at Addis Ababa and granted a visa on June 28, 2013. I kept this issue a secret from everybody except my wife for fear that government would arrest me if they become aware of my travel plans. On July 23, 2013, I came to the airport in Addis Ababa. My flight was at 4 p.m. I moved into the terminal to have my baggage weighed and moved to the final search to board the plane. At the final checkpoint, the security officer looked at my passport and told me to go and wait in a corner place alone. I was scared because I feared they would be sending me to jail to this point. Regardless of all my cautious planning, I bribed the officer to let me pass. I entered the plane very excited, praising God, feeling relieved. The plane took time to take off. I kept on praying so that the plane would take off soon so that they wouldn't call my name and say, come out. Finally, the plane departed at the Addis Ababa airport on 23 July 2013 at 6 p.m. I entered the United States through New York on 24 July 2013. The Advocates for Human Rights provided me with legal aid in my asylum case, and I worked with my lawyer, Laura Tripicano, and I was granted asylum in January 2017. I finally became a legal resident of Minnesota. Yet I am only physically in the United States. Mentally, I am in Ethiopian prisons. That is because whenever a letter or of message comes from prison, or whenever I recall these prisoners, my colleagues, I also recall my time in prison. And I imagine them in those rooms where I lived 10 years ago. I use Facebook too much, not for any other purpose, but to spread the plight of Oromo people. I received hundreds of Facebook messages via Messenger. Some are graphic pictures of peaceful protesters which are tortured, wounded, or killed by Ethiopian security forces. The activists in Ethiopia inbox such information because they will be targeted if they pass it to their own names. They want me to post it so that my followers will see it. Moreover, I also have a duty to follow up these issues. So much routine made me to live Ethiopian or Oromo dream being in the US instead of American dream. The grave violation of human rights, that ongoing genocide in Ethiopia, has made my made me lose focus in my personal life. I think it also affects most of immigrants. I can say it is not only Bekele Garba. He is one of the prisoners of conscience. It is not only Bekele Garba who is in prison. I, Nagesa Odo, am also in prison with them. It is not only Merara Gudina who is in prison. I'm mentally there with him in prison. Not only me, most Oromo Americans who are physically here in Minnesota, they are mentally affected by the ongoing genocide by the Ethiopian government. Last year, during the Grand Rally, there was a Grand Rally in Ethiopia when cities all throughout the Oromia closed business and protested. I was one of those who vocally encouraged it as a form of nonviolent resistance. The government's response was brutal. So many protesters were killed, beaten, and detained as a result. I was distraught, questioning my own actions that may have encouraged someone to take the ultimate risk. In tears, I reached out to friends looking for encouragement and wisdom. I found it. Amy Berquist told me something I recall over and over and hold on to in these difficult times. She said this: "Don't worry, the world is watching, and the killers will be brought to justice one day." Thank you very much for listening.